My name is Eric Weissman with a group called Centrifuge, which is one of the organizers behind this event. We're a startup catalyst organization headquartered here in Greater Cincinnati. I've been with the organization for about 7 years, so part of the founding team and kind of a central figure to this ecosystem that we refer to as Startup Cincy. So one of the things that we want to do today is talking about building an inclusive entrepreneurial ecosystem. And I will let my two, and I know Candace just dropped off, and fingers crossed that she'll be back on, but I want to let my two panelists introduce themselves. But the objective of this panel is to really learn and discuss what it takes to build, foster, maintain an inclusive entrepreneurial startup ecosystem with the premise of localizing these learnings, right? We want to do something, what can we learn from it here in Startup Cincy, and how can we continue to do the things that we're doing well, learn from those that are doing better than us, and help bring others along that may not be as up to speed as we are, uncover and discuss barriers, et cetera. So after these introductions, I'll kind of set the stage for the discussion and keep it as interactive as possible. So those of you that are able to, go ahead and leave some things in the chat. But we'll go have a great discussion and then keep some time. We've got about 45 minutes. Keep some time for questions at the end. But so I've got two folks with me, and right now it only seems like it's only one. But Sherelle Dorsey is here. She's the publisher of The Plug. She's written for Fast Company, Essence, other publications, ran a community. I believe it was a co-working space in Charlotte. Is that accurate?
So, we had a hub. We had a hub and more of kind of a training center in Charlotte. Yes.
And now, are you in Atlanta now, or Miami, or both? Or
I'm, between Miami, Atlanta, Seattle, and New York.
Oh my God. So welcome. Tell us a little bit more about your background and what did I leave out?
Yeah, absolutely. So I am a Seattle native. I started off in this world of tech, coming from the land of Microsoft and Amazon, as you can imagine. Did a lot of coding and programming in high school. Really was raised in a sort of technical environment with a very multicultural community. Went off to college in New York City. Worked for a bunch of different fashion and beauty brands, and then decided, I want to get back into tech in a formal capacity. Spent some time at Uber as a marketing manager, went over to Google Fiber on contract, working on sales and marketing, and eventually just found myself a bit disenchanted with the media landscape that kind of traditionally left out the inclusion of people of color, of Black people in innovation and in technology. And kind of despite having significant leadership roles and kind of traditional technology roles, we did not really see happening in the media the conversations of what was happening from a startup perspective, who was raising money, or just even the fact of very limited data collection around who was getting access to capital, who wasn't, how cities were performing when it came to inclusive entrepreneurship. So I launched The Plug really just as a daily tech newsletter covering Black and Brown founders across the US, particularly outside of Silicon Valley. It's been about 4 years now. We have a subscription-based digital news and insights platform at tpinsights.com. And, I've gotten a chance, of course, to visit Cincinnati, to work with and connect with folks like Candace and Brian Brackeen of Lightship Capital. And in Charlotte, part of the challenge in living in a city that had, I think, tremendous talent and Black and Brown professionals, there still wasn't really a hub specifically for connecting around this idea of high growth tech companies. So me and my co-founders, Enovia Bedford and Frida Hendley, we decided to come together and create Black Tech Charlotte, initially as a meetup. And that first meetup we did, we had over 150 people kind of show up, and we were like, oh, there's something here. For the last 4 years, we've been building this identity around community, helping people to get into and access tech jobs or training, or also their businesses through social capital connections and more. So that's really my story, but I am a full-time founder in building out this information platform to kind of get us to the next level and map trends on the ecosystem.
So if people want to subscribe to The Plug, make a plug for The Plug.
The plug for The Plug is we are at TP, like the plug, insights.com. So just tpinsights.com.
Great. Well, Candace, thank you for that. Candace put in the chat there that she's shutting her laptop down and restarting. So we'll just go ahead and get started and hit Candace back when she comes in. But when we talk about, if we could agree just to level set on some terms and understanding, if we agree that there are 3 pillars to an inclusive culture, and I would say in this case, an inclusive ecosystem, Candace is just still trying to get plugged in. If we can agree that there are 3 pillars to this ecosystem, to building an inclusive ecosystem, and one being representation, another being receptivity, and the third being fairness. So representation means how many different people are spoken for in that ecosystem. Receptivity is how welcoming and respectful is it for people that don't look the same. And then from a fairness standpoint, does everyone have access to the same resources? When we talk about ecosystems, a lot of times in the instance of Cincinnati, there was already an ecosystem here. Ecosystems are already built. So a lot of times and I think you were describing this with Charlotte, there was an ecosystem here. So it's a challenge for somebody to come in and do something new, because that ecosystem is already kind of doing its thing. But Sherelle, maybe you can talk a little bit more about the challenges that you obviously overcame with this Black Tech Charlotte, but what was that like, and what was you saw a need and something motivated you to say, I'm going to do something about it?
Yeah, absolutely. I think that, what entrepreneurship is all about is solving problems. And sometimes, folks don't necessarily identify that this is a need, right? I think that an existing ecosystem has happened, but it hasn't always fostered inclusivity. So when I had arrived in Charlotte in 2014 and was looking for like my tribe, so to speak, I kind of would walk into these spaces and rooms, and I would kind of be the only person that looks like me in the room, be that, being a woman or being a Black woman, there just wasn't a ton of representation. And then when I kind of went to much more culturally connected events, the conversations weren't necessarily on technology, and I didn't find those rooms to be inclusive either. And so, as I kind of searched, it was like, well, you can either kind of complain about it or continue to hop on planes and be part of these environments elsewhere. And of course, I do a ton of traveling, and I visit a lot of tech conferences. So I was kind of getting and fostering my culture and connections, elsewhere. And it was like, well, if I'm home, like I should be investing in rooting myself within the community. And so, that's when it was like, well, let's create this like Black Tech Charlotte movement. It also happened to be around the time, a few months after this gentleman, Keith Lamont Scott, had been killed by police officers. And so it was also after like mass protests in a very similar tenuous environment that we are experiencing now today after the Floyd. Yeah. And so one of the things that as me and my co-founders, we're having conversations about, like, how do we be proactive? How do we create a city and an environment that allows for economic mobility, has different kinds of discussions around what capability looks like in underserved and underrepresented communities, that doesn't tell this poverty narrative, but looks as though it is right on par with everything else, because 9 times out of 10, it actually is. And then also looks at like the vast amount of the population that does have significant education, considering that we are in a region that has a ton of historically Black colleges and universities, incredible engineering programs. And so we wanted to recognize and highlight the story that was not being told. Yeah. And so over the last 4 years, we've built up a database of over 2,000 plus, Black entrepreneurs and technologists, and really like ask them, like, what is it that you need? What are the barriers? What are the challenges? Because like I said, the poverty stories were told over and over and over again. Yeah. And those are the things. But we know that the world is much more nuanced than that. We know that communities are much more nuanced than that. And so that kind of invisible middle were those individuals who, finished college. They may have been first generation, and they were working in corporate environments, as you can imagine, Charlotte really being a hub for some of the large banks, but not really, again, getting the rest of the recognition of like, hey, we exist as well outside of just like, golfing event. So we wanted to bring that together and help to shape a new narrative where we got to own our own stories and to say, hey, like, yeah, I'm brown in this city. I care there's just as much about startups and getting access to capital for my particular my particular startup or what have you. And again, we had over 150 people RSVP for this event. My co-founders and I thought that we were going to have maybe 20, 30 people just show up. We just
Yeah.
thought we'll organize, like a meetup,
Right.
like here's some beer, some what have you. And I mean, we were bursting at the
Great.
seams. I mean, people had showed up from all across the region. Quite frankly, it wasn't just Charlotte. It was Durham. It was Winston-Salem. It was students coming from universities with their resumes
for them to gather and want to get together.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think for the first time being recognized in sort of this new environment where, we shaped it. Me and my co-founders are all kind of New Yorkers to an extent. And so we also shaped it in a fun and funky, well-designed, well-curated kind of way.
Yeah.
And so we also really were very intentional about hosting each and every one of our gatherings at different tech companies or offices or co-working spaces throughout the city. Because the other part too was just about shaping space for folks.
I want to double click on that just about going into different spaces in the city. And you mentioned banks specifically. I know that Charlotte is headquartered to a lot of them. And we have a lot of, as you know, from Cincinnati, a lot of corporate headquarters, a lot of big co's are here. And supplier diversity is a huge topic now. And it was probably 3 years ago that Stephanie Smith, the chief diversity officer now, she's the chief diversity officer for Fifth Third Bank. Her job is to get more diverse suppliers into the bank. And a lot of her suppliers were not on that tech end, right? They were consultants. They were, just kind of the construction, maybe part-time, hourly type of organizations. But here we come from a centrifuge standpoint, representing this more, venture-backed startups, innovation, and we kind of put the two things together in a complementary fashion and had a pitch competition where we exposed the decision makers at Fifth Third Bank to saying you can be both things, right? That's what was the light bulb that went off to them, is that they thought supplier diversity meant these types of business entities. And what through initiatives like Black Tech Week and some of the things that Candace really has exposed us to, we were able to bring to the forefront some of these other companies. And I want to talk through about how enlightening was that for the big co's of Charlotte to say, wait a second, I only thought of diverse suppliers on this side, and you're coming in with wow, we can do facial recognition, we can have all this type of stuff and fit some of our supplier diversity challenges, overcome those. What was that like?
Absolutely. I think that it took a little while for our kind of obscure presence to kind of trickle in, because we did have representatives from all of these banks and companies. And so they were really the folks who were able to go back to their offices and go back to their management teams and their directors and say, hey, like this whole thing with Black Tech Charlotte is something. We don't know what it is just yet, but you should pay attention. Right. And so just even today, I mean, we get recruiters who will reach out to us specifically asking for references or resources. So we've also been able to be conduits to connection points, particularly for supplier diversity team directors. And so, as they have looked at and tried to refine some of their policies, we've been invited to some of their discussions and conversations on like who is actually out there. So I think on that end, it has been much more of we can't necessarily do business or do recruiting or cultivating in the same way, because different, and especially when we talk about sort of these early startup environments and folks who are building things from their kitchen tables, they're not necessarily going to be at the gala, right? Especially if you're a startup founder. I mean, you're not going to be dropping $1,000 on a dinner or a breakfast, right? Yeah. So your spaces will look very obscure. They will look like the, our workshop, meetup, beer pong, what
Mhm.
have you. And so, for us, it was another space and location for them to get adopted to kind of take off the suit and
Right.
tie and say, like, let me kind of be in community and have conversations. And so that was kind of something that happened organically. But I think, again, like part of the ecosystem building isn't necessarily having to curate and dictate how it moves. It is providing that space, that safe space and opportunity for people to feel visible and let those connections organically happen. At some of our very first events, some of the corporate companies, and Avid Exchange, which is a payments company, which is a very large employer within Charlotte and one of the most successful startups, they would come with their entire recruiting team, their entire supplier and diversity teams. And I mean, they were just kind of hanging out. They were one of our first partners, but they would come and hang out and just like, oh my gosh, we have been looking for a pool of talent that we can tap as part of like our work. And so again, we didn't expect those things to happen. We traditionally just wanted to ensure that people felt included in the conversation of moving the city forward.
Yeah, I think that you're mentioning one of the tenets of ecosystem building is, and I do want to talk about this in the post-COVID and whatever current state we're in right now. Events aren't happening; they're all having to be virtual, which is kind of limiting. Also, from a standpoint of access, you can't just walk into a building. Now you have to have a computer, you have to have Wi-Fi connections, you have to know, the login and all that sort of stuff.
Yeah.
But really from a measurement standpoint, and this is a hot button of how do you measure success of an ecosystem? Is it quantity? Is it quality? Is it venture dollars? Is it patents formed? Is it the integration of the universities inside of the talent? Is it big co-integration? I think it's all of that stuff. But talk about how some of the ways that you quantified, as well as the qualified information that you got from how you knew it was working. There had to be some measurable things, but there was also some just it felt good.
I mean, yeah, definitely. I mean, I think all the other metrics are great and they're fancy and, they're very data driven. But I'll tell you that for me, where we felt our most impact was when our founders and our members and those who came back to us and said, like, I'm getting into tech because of you all.
Mm-hmm.
We had a physical space for a year that was sponsored and we would host trainings there. But when we first opened up, it was really a contribution of the community, from people coming to help us like put chairs and things together, in the freezing cold, and the mayor coming to kind of help us open with our grand opening, to say some few words to kind of bless the space. But I mean, we literally would have people hop off the bus, and come just to stand in the space and say, wow, like, we didn't know, 3 Black women, created this space for us.
Yeah.
And I mean, they literally had no other purpose outside of, we just wanted to see this. And so for me, those were the metrics, because you'll find out how well your ecosystem is moving from those who traditionally have been underserved and are feeling served for the very first time. You'll see that spark. You'll walk into the rooms and you'll hear like, listen, I've been working on this for so long. And this is the first time anyone has connected me to to someone to talk about getting access to capital.
Yeah, or just even talk to. Yeah. They don't realize that you are going through the same challenges. Entrepreneurship is tough, and there's only a few people who maybe fake their way through it or make it look easy, but it's all tough.
It's all very tough. It's all very tough, for sure. And I think that we did things just like, hosting lunches, bringing folks out from like Google Ventures and various firms that traditionally would not have stopped in Charlotte. And so, we would try to ensure that we knew enough about our members to understand where to help connect them. And, and even like now, I mean, when there's opportunities, I think outside of sharing job postings and things like that, and of course we've had to move virtual because we were also doing like coding camps and, like LinkedIn resume tips and tricks and
Hmm.
interview tips, like how do you pass the whiteboard test? We were doing these things in person as a community. And the challenge, of course, was making the shift to all virtual.
Yeah.
So it's like now every Tuesday we do some sort of hands-on learning virtually, and we'll start to introduce happy hours because we do miss that kind of organic gathering and
Yeah.
like meeting. And so we're trying to figure out like how do we continue to recreate that and also help people reach their goals, especially in a climate that is so uncertain and so precarious.
Yeah. One of the things that comes to mind of these traditional paradigms and tropes of startup life that it's just the way things are done, and that's not going to work anymore. And I don't think that ever worked. It just was it was a habit, and people like demo days, for instance. Demo days have traditionally been the culmination of an accelerator. I'm just bringing everybody. I know you know what they are, but just to everybody up to speed on a demo day is the graduation of an accelerator where everybody presents on stage. There's usually a big screen behind them. It's usually the founder, maybe one or two people on the team that talk about how proud they are, and they're introduced by a mentor. And they used to make a pitch for money. And that was the traditional time of when you got your funding or started to get your funding. That's all advanced now because, it's just accelerated. But we still have these demo days. And I want to talk a little bit about, are you familiar with Village Capital?
Yep.
And the peer review process that they go through. And so for those that aren't familiar with Village Capital, it's a different way of looking at venture and helping startups in non-traditional but very important fields, water tech, financial inclusion, et cetera. But what they found is that the demo day structure favored white males. They performed well up on stage. They exuded confidence, and they would be the ones who were at the end of when you looked back at a cohort that went through an accelerator. The white males were the ones that were getting the most funding. But when they flipped this, they kind of flipped the script, the Village Capital folks, and did this peer review. So at the end of every week of a cohort, the cohort evaluated itself and said, who's doing the best? Who do we vote for that Maurice is kicking ass? He's doing great. He did this week. So Maurice wins and he got points, whatever that was. And at the end of everybody agreed because you knew this going in, at the end of the cohort, the people that we evaluated as the best were the ones who were going to get the funding. And who rose to the top? It was females and minorities, and because they didn't need to be up on stage, and they didn't need to have that validation from being in front of your logo on a big stage. And I don't mean to insult demo days; they're an important symbol, but I think it is a symbol. And I want to talk about how we as a industry, if you can put startups and innovation in an industry, how do we break that paradigm of saying, what is important, and shouldn't customer traction be important, and shouldn't market size? I'm talking too much here, but I wanted to set the stage of how do we change that up? How do we change that up from the traditional demo days and do something that's a little bit more representative and maybe fair?
Yeah, Eric, I think those are great questions. I think that sometimes we've replicated Silicon Valley to our peril, and thinking that every city and every startup community has to be exactly like what we see mirrored in the Valley. And the reality is that, every city is unique. That was one of the things in Charlotte that I would say pretty frequently, that, listen, we don't have to be any other city. We have incredibly rich talent here. We have our own identity. So let's tap deeper into that, and dignify people in their processes and meet people where they are. And so I think the Village Capital model is pretty interesting, and one that can be adopted, just as you said. I think that what, Ross Barrett and his team, prior to Ross moving on to the fund he's currently at, I think it was a very brilliant model that helped to democratize access. I think that being able to pitch in front of people and to kind of shake the nerves off of like being asked questions, that's such an important part of the process, especially if you're looking to raise capital. And sometimes like it becomes more entertainment than it does actual like, help. And so we have to create like a line between what is really the opportunity. Are we just looking for founders to provide this kind of dog and pony show as part of entertainment? Or are we really looking to help them get better at landing their pitches and refining their pitches? I think that there can be room for so many different models. And then entrepreneurs themselves can also decide how they want to proceed in terms of what their fit is. Not everyone's going to be comfortable on stage. Does that mean that they don't have a great business idea or they don't have any traction, what have you? No, maybe they just suck at public speaking, and maybe it's not something that they're going to shine through on. So being able to demonstrate your various strengths, like I think everyone still has to go through a process of scrutiny and refinement, right? Like regardless, like we want to build very tough and resilient companies. But traditionally, I believe as well, and I actually wrote a piece on this for the plug around like, are these things substantive or are they spectacles? To pretend as though we are supporting women and people of color or other underrepresented groups because we like the photo op. We like to say, oh, we supported this, or here's a $5,000 check and now let's take a photo. And then it just becomes part of a diversity campaign where, again, you feel tokenized. And so I think that like, whatever the ecosystem leaders or the initiative is, if this is more about you feeling good about your brand and less about supporting the actual community you intend to serve, then you really have to look back and see, is this demo day going to be more beneficial to the actual founders, or is this only going to benefit us? Is there a better way for us to dignify and support that doesn't include the dog and pony show? And obviously from a digital perspective, we're now in a very different kind of paradigm. So I'm sure we'll see demo days in a very different kind of format. And I think, is it a demo day, or is it really more of maybe it's a, hey, here's where I need refinement, or here's the success story, and people being able to talk about like, the perils and the battles, but also kind of the triumph. And maybe that's more useful even to an audience.
Yeah, I'd love to see that. And if this is the era where demo days get broken and re-put back together, they dump the logos on the bottom, and pull them back into some other configuration, I think that would be great. We're home here in Cincinnati to the Brandery and Ocean, and now SoCap is a new one that's over in Northern Kentucky University, but it's virtual. Right? Brandery's class for the first time is virtual. This is going to happen. So how, you're not going to pack a theater anymore, and it's just not happening. So this could be the opportunity. And I hope that it is. I really do. And I wrote down, substantive versus spectacle. And I think that's a lot of what I worry about is to be sustainable. And really that's that fourth pillar. So if we talk about the three pillars, representation, receptivity, fairness, the fourth one that I would add is sustainability. How do we keep this going? How do we maintain this? Because it is a lot of work. And this firsthand from the 2,000 people that you've built up in that network that started with 150, right? And it's 10 at a time, it's 3 at a time. And then you don't lose them. And that takes a lot of hard work. One of the things that, I want to draw on is what do you suggest we overcome when we talk about, pardon my crudeness, but half-assed ideas, like entrepreneurs that have like just crazy ideas that no one thinks would work. But how do we convince those underappreciated founders that your half-assed ideas are just as good as their half-assed ideas? Like, you don't need to have, you know what I mean? Like, how do we make that more of a, one of the things that I had heard is that this is early on in the days of Union Hall, this co-working space that we have here in Cincinnati. is that underrepresented founders didn't feel welcome coming in because they felt like everybody else knew the answers. And I'm like, no, everybody else is faking it. They don't
Yeah.
know the answers either. And you just got to get over that. But it was easy for me to say that because I could just see through the BS and I'm like, oh, okay,
Right.
that's fine. That's
Right.
BS. But how do we work on drawing out those, you don't have to have a full baked idea. We're going to help you bake it, to those people that feel intimidated by that.
I think it's saying that. I think there's even in Charlotte there's a F up night.
Yeah.
And there's like actual confessions. It's like really like the taxi cab confessions of entrepreneurs. Like, here's where I really messed up. Or here's where I fell short, in my entrepreneurship journey, my leadership journey, what have you. Those kinds of moments where you have a diversity of presenters and speakers, and there's intentionality around who's being selected to share some of those stories. I think even Candace has talked about one of her initial startups failing before moving on to building Hillman Accelerator as well as Lightship Capital. Those stories are so important because we've had this narrative of like, listen, if you didn't build your company in your dorm room in college and build $1 billion, social media platform, you're not successful. And so there's almost this sense of like the first thing out of the gate has to be wildly successful. And that's just not the case, because the company I built in my dorm room, we ended up getting sued. And so it was like, and that was a wrap, and so it's just like the fact that you have to keep iterating and keep trying.
Right.
And I think that it's just ongoing transparency there. I think it is like, hey, when you do get that kind of response, it's like, hey, actually, yes, like you said, we're all kind of guessing, through all of this. But, as long as the programming continues to be inclusive and the outreach is intentional, and then there's also the sense of learning built in, for Black Tech Charlotte, we developed training labs because people were kept saying like, I don't know about this, or this. And so we had very targeted classes that in workshops that people could come to, whether they were 2 hours in the evening during the weekday or on a Saturday, everything from like, how do you develop a pitch deck? How do you negotiate partnerships? And these were very small. We called them like alternative MBA programs. And we also had different community members help to come and teach them who were experts in their field.
I really like that.
Yeah, we've hosted them at libraries. We had like a communications pro come in to talk about like, how do you write a killer email when you're reaching out for sales?
Yeah.
So all of these like very small, intimate workshop gatherings, so people can start to build their confidence, and they don't necessarily have to like expose themselves, but they're in a group setting being taught by professionals within their community that they can point to and follow up with. So they're also fostering these social connections, but there are these kind of mini environments where you can feel like, oh, that's a topic I want to learn more about. And you know what? I'm going to hop in here and I'm going to hear from everyone who's had challenges in this space so that I don't feel alone, because we're all novices before, we've done this, before any of us kind of, have done this. Like we start off in the beginning. And so I think those were different ways that we were able to help people to kind of remove their guard and feel much more included. Because we had folks who were like, I bake cakes and I sell them to people at my church. And I want to include more technology because I know this is the wave of the future. And this is like a 55-year-old, woman and whose kids have gone off to college and, is kind of trying to figure out this world of entrepreneurship, isn't 100% comfortable from a tech perspective, but would come to our classes and say, hey, like, where do I start? How do I even just start building myself a Squarespace website? And so I think there's kind of small steps that provide a layer of intimacy and safety. And at the end of the day, underrepresented folks need to feel like they're in safe spaces. That's why safe space is so incredible. They feel like I'm going to be treated well. I'm going to be treated like a human being. I'm going to be seen. My ideas are going to be validated and valid.
And the intention should be, I'm sorry for interrupting, but the intention should be pure. Like, this is a safe space because I'm trying to help you. It's not a safe space because I want a photo op.
No. Yeah. Because you can sense it. You can sense the inauthenticity. You can sense it right away when you are additive or ornamental versus actually being included in the conversation and within the space. And so, we have to make sure that like there are the checks and balances to say again, how are we reaching out, and how are we really including the ideas and the storylines as well of other individuals who typically aren't represented in these
Yeah.
spaces.
We have a question from, we've got a couple questions. I want to hit them.
Yeah.
I think we've got about maybe 6 or 7 minutes left. But you talked about building your first business, or maybe it wasn't your first business, but building a business in a dorm room, and talk about university integration into an ecosystem. And specifically as it pertains to inclusive ecosystems, because I know that universities can be a conduit of a lot of fresh talent from outside of the region, or coming here in whatever whatever city, whether it's Charlotte or Cincinnati or Albuquerque, New Mexico. They're coming in from out of town, but how do you engage and involve them, and is there a special way from a diversity, equity, inclusion standpoint to be specific about that inclusion?
I think there's so many different ways. As you mentioned, the university system has just so many areas of expertise, be it from research perspective to opportunities to connect students to job pipelines, or we've hired from like the Data Institute at the University of North Carolina at Charlotte. We've hired interns over the summer to help us with like collating our data. We have had students become members of Black Tech Charlotte, participating in some of the training labs that I had mentioned as well. And so, I think that the universities themselves are great, but it's like honing in on various aspects of the student populations where it makes sense to connect them with other startups for potential opportunities. That's where we've kind of seen a ton of traction and ability. We've also seen some of the local kind of college environments also, create space for their students within local co-working spaces, so that they can work on their projects and start to ideate, with kind of the local startup community as well, or learning how to pitch or develop, develop environments. And it's not even just, the traditional universities or colleges, it is also the community colleges. And so some of the opportunities that they provide around training and education as well, involving them in the conversation in order to let them tell their story about what opportunities they have that would be much more cost effective, require sort of less demand, especially for, folks who might be working full time and are looking for training opportunities that don't interfere with that, or you're managing families. And so you need something that, again, is going to be cost effective and also can fit to your schedule. So there's so many different touch points that can be included, as well as boot camps as well.
I look at that as, and I think you hit on all of that. One, you could work for a startup, because it's not all about student entrepreneurship, which is the second thing. So creating your startup and what you need. But then the third component is what I call a snowplow. How can you help us organize this stuff? So reaching out to the students, to the university populations and the community colleges is a great note. Another question here about safe spaces and any resistance. You talked a little bit about that, your ability to go to different places. You went to a library here and maybe a big co-lobby here, but any resistance to creating those safe spaces or reaching out to them other than the ones that you like owned?
Yeah, not at all. I'm also someone who's pretty relentless. And so I'm going to keep knocking on your door and asking to be included. And so when I was knocking on folks' doors, they were like, yeah, come on, like we've never done anything like this. So here's the key. Here's the parking pass.
Yeah, here's the code.
Yeah. And I mean, honestly, like a lot of folks, like, especially with smaller tech companies, they didn't have someone who was focused on community programming. And so, if anything, like we helped them to solve a problem they weren't even, they hadn't even started to think about. So it was kind of easy for us to kind of make that, to make that ask. And hardly anyone is going to say no around a community event. And of course, it's about respecting the space and sharing the vision, and making them partners in it as well. Not just, can I use your space, but also, are there opportunities for us to work together? Are you recruiting? Do you have any programs that we should be highlighting? Making those individuals like, multi-year, partners for potential events.
Yeah, that's great. Respecting the space and sharing the vision.
Yeah. Absolutely.
One more question here. I think we can get this one in about breaking out into from a tech standpoint and how do you get the recognition of to compete with companies that are already established? What are some ways that underrepresented founders can or should position their companies so they can be in the same breath as or same sentence as some more established companies?
As a journalist, I think that the biggest thing is really developing and cultivating relationships with local press, and not selling like fluff stories, because you don't want just like, oh, this is what this great minority person did, and more so around like, what does your traction look like? What are your vision? Having regular conversation in touch points and check-in, and really setting your vision from a leadership perspective so that the entire community knows who it is that you are.
Mm-hmm.
Showing up to these spaces and places where conversations on business are happening, be it like a chamber of commerce or a regional business alliance or what have you, and being a voice, joining some of these entrepreneurship initiatives and startup communities. And I think generally like being connected within the local startup community to the ecosystem leaders, constantly letting them know, like, here's what I'm doing, here's what I'm working on. Here's ways in which I think I can be integrated.
Just
and pitching Yeah. And I know you're building a business, but it's like pitching yourself and letting people know like, hey, I'm here, make sure that they know that you are visible and that you are building something significant.
So if you're building an ecosystem from the ground up, right, there's nothing on the table and you want to focus on minority entrepreneurs, what's the first thing that you seek out to build? First few things we'll say to seek out.
Yeah. I mean, I built it from the ground up. I built Black Tech Charlotte from the ground up, and I started literally with turning Google Fiber into this fancy, cool space and having just a meetup and putting it out there.
A space and get the people.
Yeah, we didn't overly curate it. We had food, we had wine, we had a DJ, we had a great, digital invite we pushed out on social media that went, that spread like wildfire. And we started there. And we asked, this was the only low tech thing that we did. We had easels in every corner of the space that we were in. And we asked people, what is it that they want? What is it that they see? What is it that they need? And people actually like wrote down things like mentorship, access to capital. Like, we didn't want to assume that we knew what they wanted or what they needed.
Yeah, data driven. That's how I'm reading it, that you have to listen. And listening, I think, is, I'm embarrassed that I didn't say that until now, but listening is key to building an inclusive ecosystem.
You're constantly collecting data. You're constantly asking questions. You're constantly having conversations, and you're collecting that. And that's how we started, is just constantly. And that's how we came up with the training programs, because people kept saying like, we don't know this, or we don't have this. And then it was like, okay, everything we did was based on knowing and understanding our members.
Right.
And from there on, we were able to build things that were specifically tailored to them and their needs.
Yeah. And I think that goes back to, the tropes and the paradigms that we've got of, well, I always do a demo day. Well, do we need to do a demo day? Are we listening to what people really need? Especially our founders. We're just making them get up on stage. Listening really is key. Well, great. We're out of time. I want to respect the rest of the main stage stuff and the other things that are going on. I want to thank you, Sherelle, for not just joining us here, but for all of the stuff that you're doing for underrepresented and underappreciated founders across the country. I'm sorry that Candace couldn't join us, but maybe that'll give her an excuse to come back, and we'll do this again on a big stage. Sure. I'd love to. One of the biggest things that I've learned from one of my mentors and close friend, Wendy Lee, who was the CEO here of Centrifuge, is that the key on diversity, inclusion, and equity is to be intentional. And that's what I hope to do. And I hope that we do, that we learn from all of this, and that we take these strides to be intentional, to make a difference, to make it sustainable. And I will definitely be modeling a lot of our behaviors off of your learnings and the stuff that you've paved the way. So thank you.
Well, thank you for having me. I greatly appreciate this, and looking forward to continuing to follow your work.
Great. Awesome. Well, thanks, everyone. Thanks, Sherelle. Be safe. Good seeing you.